Hello, everyone. Welcome to Impactr's second webinar. I'm Giorgia. I'm a student in industrial engineering at DTU, and I'm a sustainability analyst intern at Impactr. I want to thank you all for participating to this webinar. And as it was for the first session, due to lack of time, I will not be able to see the chat or the questions you may write. So I kindly ask you to write them in the dedicated box, the Q&A, and I'll try to answer to all of them at the very end of this session. In case you don't know what we do at Impactr, this is our mission. We aim to make sustainability action accessible for everyone, and this is what really matters for us. As far as I'm concerned, I decided to go through the more than 250 pages of the Global Sustainable Development Report because I think it's important to understand where we are, why we got to this point, and how can we move forward together and in the right direction so that we don't make the same mistakes again. So if you haven't found the time to read the report, the report is called The Future is Now. This is the right opportunity to get informed. It is a very long report. So for whom of you that didn't attend the first webinar, you can find the recorded version on our social media. So in the first webinar, what you need to know, I presented facts and infographics about the state of the world. We went through topics like poverty, energy decarbonization, food systems, climate change, and so on. In this session, we're going to focus on the actions that different stakeholders can adopt to bring the world back on track to comply with Agenda 2030. In fact, from the words of Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, we are not on track for achieving most of the 169 targets that comprise the Sustainable Development Goals. Recent trends show that several dimensions are not even moving in the right direction, presaging a move towards the crossing of negative tipping points, which would lead to dramatic and irreversible changes in the condition of the Earth system. So the Global Sustainable Development Report was written after 4 years of the establishment of the 17 SDGs by an independent group of 15 scientists appointed by the Secretary General. And one of them was Catherine Richardson, which is professor at University of Copenhagen and also member of the Impactr Advisory Board. So as you may know, the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is a globally agreed mandate for transformation. In that, a framework of 17 goals, the so-called SDGs, was presented in order to create a pathway for urgent and inclusive actions. But beside the 17 goals and the targets that they comprise, it is also important to consider the interactions among all of them. And from this picture, you can see that all the goals are interconnected, meaning that working for one goal will affect all other goals in one way or another. In most cases, as you can see, the ones that in the picture are blue, the interconnections are beneficial, meaning that taking action towards one goal will also lead to advancements in relation to other goals. However, there are also many trade-offs to take into consideration. In fact, the orange spots in this picture indicate that if you advance on a target for one goal, it will have a negative effect on a target for another goal. And one example, as you can see, is for goal number 13, climate action, because some climate change mitigation actions, like protective measures against rising sea levels, might have a negative effect on marine life, affecting thus goal number 14. And this is very important to understand because it is not possible to address one or few goals at a time. Such an approach is often adopted by companies, and it is sometimes referred to as SDG bingo, which is ticking off each of the goal in turn and calling out, let's say, the full house. And this can clearly have potential and, of course, unintended negative consequences. Therefore, a systemic approach is the only way forward. So the Global Sustainable Development Report identifies 6 entry points, chosen because they offer the most promise for achieving the desired change at the scale and speed needed for the 2030 agenda. Of course, each of them will have direct effects on different SDGs, but as we've just seen, all the SDGs are interconnected, so all the SDGs will be affected by all the 6 entry points. And these entry points are human well-being and capabilities, which is the key to the missions of eradicating poverty and reducing inequalities to leave no one behind. Sustainable and just economies, as we know, because we know that economy activity provides livelihoods, jobs, and the means to attain many other elements of a better life. Food systems and nutrition patterns, which is an essential point for nourishment and human health, of course. Energy, decarbonization, and universal access, because we know that energy and, of course, the access to it is the key to economic growth, but also to poverty eradication and the realization of human potential. Then we have urban and peri-urban development, which is very important to address because more than half of the world population already live in urban areas. And this number is actually growing, offering us the opportunity to achieve multiple goals at scale and with efficiency. And the last entry point is global environmental commons, which are biodiversity, atmosphere, ocean, and land, and that are essential for the balance between nature and humanity. The Global Sustainable Development Report also identifies 4 levers that can contribute to systemic change for each of the 6 entry points. The report argues, though, that only by pulling all the 4 levers simultaneously together, it will be possible to achieve the necessary transformation to be back on track. And these 4 levers are governance, which includes not only governments and agreements between states, but also non-state actors like the private sector and civil society organizations that can be able to support, let's say, more effective policy interventions. The second one is economy and finance, both from the public and private sectors, which include many incentives and trade policies to accelerate broader progress towards sustainable development. Then we have individual and collective action, because individual participation and empowerment are essential forces for advancing sustainable development. And the last one is science and technology, both in public and private sectors, because we know that science can assess evidence and anticipate future consequences of our actions. And also we know that technology can enable the shift from business as usual, and it can be also central to resolving the trade-offs that can arise when addressing individual goals or targets in isolations. So after the presentation of the entry points and levers, we can say that the report's call to action is systemized by going through how each of the 4 levers are applied to each of the 6 entry points. So let's do the same, starting with the first entry point, human well-being and capability. But before we start, let's remind us of the situation in relation to this entry point. So during the last decades, great improvement have been made in areas of human well-being and capabilities, including improvements in life expectancy, education, and quality of life. However, there are still extreme deprivations in least developed countries, high levels of poverty, illiteracy, and under 5 and maternal mortality, millions of people lacking access to safe drinking water and sanitation services. So what could the four levers do? First of all, about governance, provide universal access to healthcare and education, and basic infrastructure services like clean water, sanitation, energy, telecommunications, and other. So basically, lower barriers for the poorest, for example, by making healthcare or education very cheap or free. Also, governance should ensure the availability of high quality services, for instance, with long opening hours and continuous education for the staff. And it should also eliminate discriminations in laws and norms, which includes, for example, non-discrimination laws in hiring practices and wages, also targeted skills training, and campaigns that seek to reduce stigmatization of certain groups of people. And lastly, governance should expand social protection to increase resilience, because millions of people right now that are unable to participate in the labor market need support so that they are able to withstand hardship. So let's go with the second lever, economy and finance. First of all, they need to incentivize private sector investments in capabilities. For example, performance evaluations for managers and companies at all levels should include their contribution to social well-being, improving communities and building capabilities of employees. And also, this lever should increase incentives for private sector to invest in public goods, for instance, by taxation or direction of profits towards public goods. And one example of a successful business initiative is the one from Viv Healthcare Company, which ensures the access to its innovative treatment for HIV with royalty-free voluntary licenses offered in all the least developed countries. And this allows the companies manufacturing generic medicines to produce low-cost version of this medicine. Another thing that this lever can do is to increase public-private partnership, ensuring that citizen needs are kept at the forefront, because we know that often the public sector does not have the financial means by itself. And also it needs to coordinate system for funding, because we are lacking of an overview of needs and funding. Lastly, they should increase access to finance, because people without access to a bank account are very vulnerable. And one mean for financial inclusion can be mobile phone systems of banking and money transfer, which actually already exist in Kenya and Bangladesh, because this kind of system can reach the unbanked people. About the individual and collective actions, there's a need to translate evidence into options in order to stimulate a shift in behaviors, because we know that behavioral changes only happen if evidence is presented in the right way. So for instance, we could do that through the use of the social media. And also, we need to address barriers to technology use, because there are examples in the world where better or safe solutions are not adopted due to cultural resistance. Lastly, we need to empower everyone for collective action, making sure that all the voices are heard through, for instance, institution of unions or women's collectives, etc. For the last lever, the science and technology, it is crucial to apply new technologies to support universal access to healthcare and healthcare facilities. And this could be done with drone deliveries, online training, or for instance, 3D printing. There's also a need to generate better data, because policy making needs to be much more informed and based on data. And the data need to be collected, and the decision makers need to be taught to understand it, of course. This LIVA should also advance medical research and applications through, for example, collaboration between R&D institutions with a special focus on low and middle income countries. And lastly, the access to technology and informations needs to be increased, as we know that half of the world population is not online, with the biggest fraction being women and people living in rural areas. So now let's go through the second entry point, sustainable and just economies. Economic growth has increased national income significantly, and more than 20 countries since 2000 have reduced the annual greenhouse gases emissions while growing their economy. However, we still have aspects of economic growth and current production systems that perpetuate deprivations, generate socio-economic and gender inequalities, deplete the global environmental commons, and threaten irreversible damage. If we take a look at what governance can do about this, first of all, it needs to establish regulations to drive innovation, such as cap and trade or carbon taxes. Also, there should be a proactive policies for just transitions, for instance, offering social protection coverage, reskilling programs, practical transition options, and support to bolster communities. About economy and finance, incentive to direct private capital toward more sustainable productions need to be created because the current transition is too slow. For instance, a sustainable development investment label could be a tool to assess the existing flows contributing to the achievement of these SDGs in proportion to the total annual global investment. Moreover, we need a fiscal systems to facilitate fair redistribution and a focus on public sector research and development, especially for strategic and long-term research. About individual and collective action, first of all, we need to reduce waste-oriented demand and promote responsible consumption. Secondly, workers should continue to play the role of agents of change, because we know that in the past, workers' organizations helped a lot to ensure better wages and work conditions and better work conditions. And this, of course, can be achieved through organization or labor unions. Lastly, we need to change social norms and laws that limit women's labor participation and perpetuate other differences at work. For instance, with the establishment of care services for elderly or young children, paternity leave, equal pay, and so on. So about science and technology, first of all, technologies may help resolve trade-offs between production and the environment. For example, renewable energy off-grid allows electrification of remote rural areas without transmission line. And another example could be the use of a smartphone, because we know that it replaces many other things, an alarm, a computer, whatever you can think of. However, care has to be taken, as a smartphone may not reduce consumption. In fact, this can apply not only for a smartphone, but when things become more accessible, cheaper, and more convenient, many people tend to increase the consumption of that particular object, which in this case outweighs the savings of the smartphone itself. Also, we need a holistic assessment of the new technology. If we look at the next entry point, food system and nutrition patterns, we know that because of its climate and environmental impacts and shortcomings in healthy, safe nutrition for all, today's global food system is unsustainable. However, the challenge of transitioning food system onto a sustainable trajectory is not insurmountable. Recent studies describe food systems capable of delivering nutrition food for a global population of 9 to 10 billion with greatly reduced environmental impacts. So let's see how this can be achieved by the four levers. First of all, governance should promote social protection programs in order to help vulnerable populations, or for instance, help farmers to withstand environmental shocks. There's also a need for legislation, for instance, rewarding protection of ecosystem services and discouraging negative impacts. A responsible supply chain should also be fostered through certification or labeling, giving support also to small-scale farmers to enter such certification schemes. And lastly, governance should strongly promote gender parity, because we know that women are increasingly into the agricultural production, but they are not represented properly in the development of new agricultural practices. About economy and finance, reliable insurance opportunities are important to help small-scale farmers withstand and recover from environmental shocks. Moreover, trade agreements need to be established in order to reduce inequalities for goal number 10, create decent work and inclusive economic growth for goal number 8, and contribute to climate action, goal number 13. Lastly, to compete with the output of the industrial agricultural systems, the small-scale farmers need better access to markets, groundwater and irrigation, credit and finance. About the individual and collective actions, it seems a little obvious, but it is extremely important for us to reduce food waste. And there's also a need to ask for and promote nutrition policies and provision of integrated food and nutritional support and services. And of course, this is a little obvious as well, but we need to change our dietary habits to a more plant-based diet. About science and technology, it is important to develop new technologies towards lower environmental impacts and better nutrition for sustainable agriculture and food system. Possible ways for doing this are organic farming, genetically modified organisms, and precision agriculture. Also, an agroecological information system should be developed through, for instance, the use of drones or space-based Earth observatory. And both infrastructure and transportation should be shifted towards more sustainable practices, especially with regard to rural roads and electricity infrastructures. For the next entry point, energy decarbonization and universal access, the report states that energy poverty remains extensive, with 140 million people lacking access to electricity and more than 3 billion people relying on polluting solid fuels for cooking, which causes an estimated 3.8 million premature deaths each year. On the other hand, providing clean and efficient energy for all in a climate-friendly way is economically and socially desirable, and is technically feasible. The benefits are predicted to outweigh the cost of transforming our energy system by a factor of 3. So what could the 4 levers do in this case? First of all, governance, both national governments and private sector, should make long-term planning and well-designed policies, and it should prepare mandatory decarbonization plans for industries or incentivize participation in carbon trading schemes. In addition to that, there should be a precise carbon taxation to be followed in order to avoid carbon leakage. And the revenue from these carbon taxes should be used for further acceleration of green transition. Also, efficiency standards and regulations might have an essential role in reducing energy consumption, as well as labeling schemes and incentives. For individuals, we can say that we already witness a shift towards a greener lifestyle, but this shift needs to be even faster. Also, individuals should claim greater energy efficiency and higher rates of renewables, while changing current practices that rely on excessive energy use. And one of the most recent and famous case of this claiming, let's say, is Greta Thunberg, which we know has inspired a worldwide youth movement for climate change action. About the fourth lever, technology should help increase energy access and move to a decarbonized pathway, while R&D departments, both from public and private sector, should support the necessary infrastructure for these key technologies. And last but not least, governments will need to design policies and incentives to encourage the necessary investments for these technologies. The current situation for the fifth entry point, the urban and peri-urban development, can be seen in this slide. Cities, in fact, can create opportunities for employment, poverty alleviation, and growth. And they are hubs of research and development, with concentrations of academic, scientific, and private sector institutions that drive innovations. But at current rates of growth, by 2030, 60% of the world's population will live in cities. And by 2050, that proportion will be nearly 70%, and at least 15% of that urban population will be living with some kind of disability. So let's see now what kind of actions the four levers can make to solve this situation. First of all, urban development should proceed in a well-planned, evidence-based, and integrated manner through cooperations and exchange of knowledge on regional, national, and international level. There should also be an inclusive and participatory urban governance, taking into account the priorities and values of all stakeholders, of course. For example, promotive active decentralization by devolving responsibility to the lowest or, let's say, least centralized level of governance is important for effective policy making or service provision and budgeting. Another action that governance could take is securing land and property rights, because currently less than 30% of the global population has documentary land rights. About the actions from the economy and finance lever, investments for massive infrastructure should be made for a sustainable urban development. Also, the economic activity of cities needs to revolve around poor development and access to decent jobs for all, with special attention to access for women, youth, persons with disabilities, and other vulnerable groups. Lastly, there's the need to invest in sustainable and technology-enabled industries and livelihoods. About collective actions, the individuals should both organize citizen campaigns and adopt greener lifestyle choices, as we already saw before. About science and technology, policymakers and other stakeholders need to plan in a responsible way to take full advantage of the role that technology will play in the development of sustainable cities. In some cases, in fact, the economies of scale in providing services in cities will become less significant, and as technology enables remote and virtual service provision. Lastly, two actions should be fostered. The first one being the circular economy, and we talked a little about that in the first session, in the first webinar. And the second one being naturbanity, which can be defined as a close connection between people and nature to protect biodiversity in cities, enhance human health and well-being, and also to strengthen climate resilience. So let's go through the last entry point, global environmental commons. As I said at the beginning, the 4 global commons are biodiversity, land, atmosphere, and oceans, and they contribute to the functioning of the Earth system and hence to supporting life. Actions on global environmental commons should help secure human well-being and the survival of all living species. But the stock of natural capital is currently deteriorating far beyond its rate of renewal. Waste generated by human activities, including hazardous chemicals, plastics, and e-waste, something that we already talked about in the previous webinar, have reached levels beyond the Earth system's absorption capacity. So let's see now what governance could do about this particular situation. First, organizational change and systematic approaches should be adopted to experiment with different governance solutions that are tailored to particular scales and social context. And this is because society can learn and adapt their own governance solutions to a particular situation. There's also a need for overarching rules and goals, like the SDGs themselves, but also for multilateral agreements and platforms, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, in order to protect the global commons. Lastly, governance should coordinate multi-stakeholders platforms, regulated market mechanisms, and establish legislative boundaries so as to have an adaptive governance. About the economy and finance, there should be science-based target initiatives that can reward industries, but also alternative business models to shift from the business as usual. And one successful model is the chemical leasing model, which is an example of circular economy. Based on this model, it will be the model will provide only as much let's say as much specially formulated paint as is needed for the number of items to be painted, avoiding thus among other things, of course, excessive high volume sale of paints. Lastly, impact investments, for instance, for climate mitigation projects, should be fostered, especially for the achievement of social and environmental benefits alongside a financial return. Moving to the individual actions, people must continue to adopt pro-environmental behaviors, being supported also by a cultural transformation. But also individuals should take the responsibility to become active stewards and agents of change of their own life support systems, and also to find ways of reversing environmental damage. Through the use of certification systems, it should be possible to prevent the deforestation of old growth forests, which we know are crucial for carbon absorption. And lastly, we need an integrated energy system that can coordinate green energy supply, energy demand, and carbon sequestration or capture. To conclude our journey through the Global Sustainable Development Report, the assessment carried out by these 15 scientists states that the Agenda 2030 is possible, but it requires let's say, unprecedented, massive, and rapid pervasive transformations of our society on a global scale. And this is not a matter of ordinary incremental change. We need a disruptive change. And this can only be done through a truly systemic approach to the entire complex of goals and underlying targets. Hard choices will need to be made, and this require strong political leaderships and novel collaboration with governments, businesses, finance, civil society, and academia. And as we saw, these are the 4 levels that the that the report identified. And as I said at the beginning, we are not on track, so we don't have time to waste. And as we are all a stakeholder and participant in all the 6 entry points described in the report, we all have a role to play in this disruptive transformation. Like I did in the first webinar, I want to remind you the words of Professor Muhammad Yunus, that at One Young World 2019 said that you don't have to change your country, just change your neighborhood. Actually, this is what we would like to achieve at Impactr, because we aim to create localized Impactr X cells all over the world in order to exchange knowledge and create tangible actions together, but with many local actions. Therefore, we want to encourage everyone to be able to get involved, or even better, to organize an Impactr X session in their local community. You can also take a look at our Impactr TV, where you can find the 3-part interview series United Behind the Science. And this is an interview that we made with Professor Catherine Richardson, that, as I said at the beginning, was one of the 15 scientists appointed by Secretary General to contribute to the report. And she's a member of Impactr Advisory Board. And don't forget the launching of our Impactr app in January, available first on the Apple Store and soon after for Android devices. If you want to know more about the status of the world, we're planning monthly webinars aligned with the SDGs planning calendar for 2020. So for instance, in March, where we have the International Women's Day, you will be able to attend a webinar regarding gender equality and so on. So stay tuned. Thank you so much for your attention. Remember that everyone can become an impactor and take action today. So please join our community on impactors.global.